Hello there. Now, the Prime Directive enforced we often see by Starfleet, which we should point out is a Starfleet regulation, not a Federation law. Strict interpretation of the Prime Directive would be that you don't interfere in one way or another politically, militarily, economically within the internal policies of another civilization. You do not help in their development, you do not guide their development, you do not interfere with their development, and you do nothing that could shape the destiny of that species, even if it is to the detriment of yourself or your crew. There are multitudes of reasons for this, evaluated, established throughout time before the Prime Directive was actually brought into play. A version of the Prime Directive actually existed under Vulcan law long before the formation of the Federation. Now, again, this law doesn't apply, strictly speaking, to non-Starfleet personnel, as it is not a Federation law as such. I mean, I suppose if they deliberately go out of their way to harm, say, a developing civilization, that can be bad and probably comes with separate laws and separate crime and punishment regulations. But, all things considered, it is not a law. But sometimes people violate it, and if they can justify it, great. If not, then not so great, and you can incur punishment. Why are we talking about this? Because if you clicked on this video, you know that's not the topic of this video. We're getting to that, be patient. We're talking today about the ECS Horizon. This was a 22nd century Earth cargo ship run by the Mayweather family. If that name's familiar, Travis Mayweather was the chief helms officer aboard the NX-01 Enterprise, Earth's first deep space, truly deep space, Warp 5 capable starship, and the first of the NX-class starships, which would go on to pioneer the future of Starfleet space exploration within Starfleet for Earth, humanity, and the Federation. It would also be the basic template design, more or less, for all future iterations of exploratory vessels used by Starfleet. Again, as I mentioned previously, I do have an upcoming video where I'm going to explore the different design lineages, because there do seem to be a few different ones, but the general source of section engineering hull nacelles starts here, even though it didn't have a strict engineering hull when it was first launched. So, the Horizon, though, was not a Starfleet ship. It was a civilian vessel. Now, this particular ship was a J-class freighter. It was a little smaller than some of the other freighters around, but was a very, very user-friendly and adaptable platform of a starship. Basically, it was a big baggage train of cargo pods pulled around by a warp sled, effectively, which could detach from them and operate independently if it needed to. In its launch variant, it was only equipped with a single plasma cannon. This was designed as a little more described as a pop gun to shoot rogue asteroids or other things in the way of the ship the deflectors didn't knock out of the way. It was not a weapon for defense, really. I mean, you could use it for it, but it was not a powerful weapon, because humanity simply didn't think that these things needed such things, despite thousands of years of evidence to the contrary of dealing with pirates and other such things on Earth. We really thought there weren't going to be any out there. It was pretty self-evident quickly to the crews of these ships and others like it that more firepower and better defenses were needed. So better security protocols, better communication codes, getting to where you wanted to go faster, not making unnecessary diversions or stops, and knowing where each other were to help each other for safety reasons was essential. For example, another freighter was once attacked, and the Horizon learned of it, because they communicate, and they were warned of Nausicaan raiders in the area. So the freighters are communicate. So communication is key, as well as upgrading that firepower as soon as possible. So they would carry additional weapons when needed, or whenever they could possibly upgrade, make the weapon they had stronger, get more of them. This usually consisted mostly of more plasma cannons and better hull plating, but for the most part, these were not combat vessels. These things were just defensive only. The ship was not capable of speeds in excess of Warp 2. In fact, it couldn't even touch Warp 2. So it was not the fastest ship around. It spent a lot of its time operating in the area space near to Earth, operating between Vega Colony, Earth, Dralax, and a few other places. Notable encounters by the ship were an encounter with a Deltan starship when Mayweather, who was at this point only 15 years old, only being born aboard the starship as a so-called boomer, in 2126, the ship itself incidentally being launched in 2102. describing the encounter with the Deltans as they were very open. I think we all know what he meant by that, as we know kind of what Deltans are like in the Star Trek universe. Giggity. Now, the Horizon herself had a very compact bridge. Generally speaking, it was a chaotic field. A lot of children were born aboard these ships. You'd raise families, start families, and generally, if you were aboard these ships, sometimes this would be the only life you'd ever know. Your journeys back to Earth would not be never, but they would be every few years at best. So, generally speaking, the crews aboard these ships became family, and sometimes literally became family, as again Travis Mayweather can attest. If it weren't for these things, he never would have been born. Eventually, the ships would receive upgrades with Warp 3 engines that would sort of diminish this culture a little bit, but still, for decades, that's kind of how things rolled aboard the J-class. And in many ways, these were the pioneering vessels of humanity. It was a long time before ships like the Franklin, the Enterprise, the Intrepid, other such vessels that had higher warp capabilities would actually go out. Of course, we had earlier ships like the earlier ring ship Enterprise, ships like the Valiant, and a few other vessels that had been sent on a handful of deep space missions, but these ships weren't out there to support the freighters. They were on either very highly specific missions, such as the colonization of the Nova's colony, or ships like the Valiant that were sent out on exploratory missions. A few ships built like that. Again, these ships were too slow and not very powerful, so they weren't much use to support the freighters. Would have had very little, if any, interactions with them. The Enterprise was a different story. Much faster, bigger, more heavily armed. It was more of a presence. But the Horizon, like many freighters of her type in her generation, had to look after herself, and they had to decide how humanity would go forward, and were often its ambassadors. Now, yes, they were tradesmen and they were there to make money, basically, find new resources, but they also had to establish good trade relations, so they became good diplomats as well. Learning how to deal with the pirates is one thing, learning how to deal with alien tradesmen who have completely different cultures you've never met before, languages you can't even understand. That was a completely new skill set and something that hadn't really been seen amongst humans since the age of sail, when encountering cultures of humanity that the people building those ships had never encountered and therefore knew nothing of the local customs or languages. And this was something that had to be redeveloped here. Meaning, again, effectively these ships were the pioneers of humanity for about 50 years or more, with only a handful, as I said, of Earth Space Probe Agency and Starfleet ships actually being sent out on deep space assignments. Most ships of this era, particularly Starfleet vessels, stayed closer to home for defense and basically establishing themselves locally, the Vega system and Proxima system, places like that, not really being able, because of limited technology, to go out on such missions. And unlike the freighter crews, they were less willing to start families. These were professionals, effectively naval personnel. They weren't going to go out and make babies on long-distance generational vessels. That really wasn't what they'd signed up for. So those kinds of missions were left to the freighter crews. So why then did I open up with talking about the Prime Directive? Well, the Horizon, again, as I said, ship full of families. Very much a ship of its era, very clustered, very compact, everything you'd ever need in it, including books. Books about gangsters. It was established about 100 years after this time period, after 2153, when we actually encounter the Horizon, or the Enterprise encounters the Horizon. About 100 years later, a ship called Horizon crash-landed on a planet called Sigma Lotia 2. The Lotians that live on the planet were humanoid, pretty much human in appearance, but with a very adaptable culture, and they recovered a book from the crash called Chicago Gangsters. This was a very detailed book that described many things about gangster life and culture. Now, seeing this as a sort of Bible of sorts, they adapted their entire culture to live like the book said. So they became an entirely gangster-based culture, and they began to produce vehicles and weapons and even buildings and clothing based on the descriptions inside the book. Although I question many things like the mechanical workings of those cars. How detailed was this book? Did it actually tell you how to build an internal combustion engine? I assume there were pictures of the cars, which is how they knew what they looked like, but these people must have built their own engines. A side story, maybe even something separate to look into one day. But now it is implied through the library of information and books that we see aboard the ECS Horizon, when you see a copy, a hardback copy of the book, Chicago Gangsters, on a shelf on that ship. Is this a coincidence? Maybe. Is this just an Easter egg? Also maybe. Because actually there's never been any clear distinction as to what exactly the Horizon was that crashed on the ship. Yes, it's described as a USS Horizon, but remember, ships at this era weren't called USS, but the NX-01 would eventually be redubbed USS when the Federation was formed, as would the USS Columbia or other such vessels, because Starfleet would become Federation. It would not be uncommon for many ships of this era, not beyond belief, for the ECS Horizon to be rechristened USS Horizon. And this be the very ship that 100 years later would crash onto the Lothian planet and violate the Prime Directive, influencing their cultural development and causing their civilization to take a catastrophic, somewhat, some might even argue, left turn to becoming much more Earth-like, of sort of 1920s gangster culture in New York City, but on a global scale. Their entire population of Al Capones. All of them. But that is one of the reasons why the Prime Directive is so important. After all, if this hadn't have happened, their culture would have progressed more naturally and they could have become something very different. Instead, it sort of started to morph them into a much more violent society. One obsessed with the accumulation of wealth and power and one-upmanship on one another and, drive-by shootings and alcohol abuse and gambling. Cultural stereotypes that are associated with typical gangster culture of that era. So that is one of the reasons the Prime Directive exists. Now, it's not the reason the Prime Directive exists, because of course this happened many years later, but it is debatable as to whether or not this is their fault. The ship crashed. It didn't intentionally give them this information. It is possible their civilization would also have been able to reverse engineer technology from the crashed ship. But that's another speculation. This is, though, why such things exist, why we have the Prime Directive in the Federation, because such influences can be dangerous, they can be deadly. Sometimes it seems like such an easy thing, it's like, well, we could just move the asteroid so it doesn't destroy them. And I personally think they should do things like that. Exceptions should be made. Sticking to the Prime Directive so rigidly is perhaps not the right thing to do. But sometimes it's a moral quandary. Dr. Flux pointed it out once. He developed a medical cure for a disease that would save one of two civilizations on the planet, but that one civilization was holding back the other. If he saved them, he was altering the natural course of the evolution of their people, and therefore helping to suppress and keep back and hold back the natural evolution of another. What was the right thing to do? My personal morality, going to chip in, he should have saved them. Because you're talking about a technologically sophisticated civilization. Natural course of evolution is no longer a thing. Everything is unnatural at this point. Medicine would save them. Letting them die was immoral. I think he was wrong, but by all means, if you think he was correct, sticking to the Prime Directive rule. But that is the Horizon. I personally prefer the idea that this ship was the Horizon that crashed on Signal Ocean 2. The coincidences of it happening to be called the Horizon. It was an older ship, so the chances of it crashing were increased. I mean, I can't see many 23rd century vessels losing control so easily and crashing on a planet like that. But I could see an older, well, by that point, at least 150-year-old cargo ship. I could see that crashing. And yeah, the violation of the Prime Directive. Wasn't their fault. No foul. Some harm, but not intended. But that, again, is the ECS Horizon. We do see the ship continue to operate long after this, after their encounter with the Enterprise. So again, my headcanon is very easily to do that. It could be just an Easter egg, but what do you guys think? Let me know in the comment section down below. Do you think they are the same vessel as portrayed in 100 years later, which crashed on the planet? Because some information does account for that being possibly a Daedalus class ship called the Horizon. It's possible. It could be coincidental. It could also be Starfleet's long-held tradition of when you build a new ship, commission a new vessel with a previous vessel's name and registry, you take a part of that ship and integrate it, for whatever reason, ceremonially into the construction of the new ship. Maybe parts of the ECS Horizon made their way into the USS Horizon, a Daedalus class ship, and from there somehow the book made it, the same crew went over. Maybe. Speculation again. But if you made it all to the end of my little ramble, I hope you enjoyed this video. Please like, share, and subscribe, and bye-bye.